Hello and welcome everyone to another year at the Chabura. We are delighted to begin the year with a class from our Rosh Bet Midrash Rabbi Dweck on the Teshuvot of Rambam. Before we begin, I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to a few upcoming events. Firstly, this Thursday night at 7 p.m., Da'at Press will be having a book launch in New York City for two of our recent publications, Understanding Peshat and the Chain of Tradition. We'll be joined by Rabbi Yosef Sanikian and Jackson Gardner. Secondly, next Monday, we will see the return of the monthly question and answer with Rabbi Dweck. So please do submit any questions you may have online. Without further ado, we will begin this week's class on the Teshuvot of Harambam. And as Ohad likes to say, Chacham, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be back. And I was asked for our initial shiur or talk to look at a teshuvah from Harambam. So that's what we're going to do. I chose this teshuvah because I think that it's an interesting teshuvah, and I think that is a bit pertinent in terms of a few things that we might be considering lately. The question is it mutar to teach a goy Torah, right? Is there a problem with teaching a goy Torah? So before we get into the Teshuvah proper, and what I will say is that there are several girsaot to this Teshuvah. It's printed in the Shelot Teshuvot Be'er Hador, but the Shelot Teshuvot Be'er Hador have another presentation in the what's known as the Hotzaat Makitze Nirdamim, which is much more accurate because it has dealt with several Kitvei Yad, and that's what we're going to look at. However, interestingly, with regards to this Teshuvah, the version of the Teshuvah that is printed in Pe'er Hador leaves out a huge chunk of the Teshuvah that we otherwise have in the Mekitzei Nirdamim. And the Teshuvah Mekitzei Nirdamim is presented by Rav Kafer in the Mishneh Torah in his commentary. So what we're going to do is first we're going to orient around the Teshuvah, and then we'll have a look at the Teshuvah proper. So I will share my screen with y'all. Let's share. Okay. And what we have over here is the basic sugya. So in Masechet Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yohanan says, Goy she'osek b'Torah hayav mitah. Says that a goy that is engaged in Torah or studies Torah, it doesn't say studies, but osek is involved in Torah, right? Works in Torah. Hayab mitah. And I really do think, by the way, that all of these specifics of words are important, right? Because we kind of read them and think of them as synonyms, but they're not. It doesn't say goy shelamad Torah, right? It says goy she'osek b'Torah, which is important. But nonetheless, what that literally means is that a goy who is working in Torah, studying and engaging in the endeavor of Torah, hayav mitah. He is basically culpable to death. Now, normally when we say hayav mitah, we of course don't mean by bet din, we mean bidei shamayim. Otherwise, we would say neherag, as we will see soon, that he's to be put to death. But it doesn't say that he's to be put to death. It simply says that he's culpable for death, bidei shamayim. Now, the reason for this, the Hachamim, Rabbi Yohanan says, Shenei Amar Torah sivalanu Moshe, morasha. So it says that the Torah is given to us by Moshe. Morasha, it's our inheritance. Lanu morasha velo lahem. It is an inheritance that is given to us and not to them. And so in a certain sense, it is theft, that they are stealing something that does not belong to them, right? So which is why I think that it's significant to see that it's osek b'Torah here, right? Somebody that's stam reading Torah, or reading through halachot or whatever the case may be, is not necessarily stealing something that belongs to us. But when they are osek b'Torah, as though this is the endeavor of their life, that's a different story. And they're taking it for them when it really doesn't belong to them. Now, the Gemara questions this assertion. Rabbi Meir essentially questions this assertion by Rabbi Yohanan, and it says, Minayin she'afilu goy ve'osek b'Torah shehu kekohen gadol. It says, it does say, the Gemara question says, look, Rabbi Meir seems to be saying something, or is known to have said something diametrically opposed to this, It would seem, because it says a goy that is osek b'Torah is tantamount to the Kohen Gadol, meaning that his honor, his kabod, the way that we relate to such an individual, should be like we relate to the Kohen Gadol. And of course, the Kohen Gadol is always used as the highest level of kabod, right? Very often. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, asher ya'aseh otam hadam v'chai b'hem. It says in the pasuk that a human does these things, meaning engages in mitzvot and lives by them. Kohanim levim yisraim lo ne'emar. Right? It doesn't say that.
Luis, I was.
We need somebody to shut their volume, which I'm not in charge of, or their thing. So it says Shneimar asher ya'aseh otam hadam v'chai b'hem. It doesn't say Kohanim levim yisraelim v'chai b'hem, which essentially is the various groups of Israel, Elahadam. Rather, it's a human being can live by engaging with Torah. Halamata. You see from the very peshat of the pasuk, afilu goy ve'osek b'Torah hareu kekohen gadol. Right, that even a goy who works toils in Torah, makes Torah, the guiding frame of his life. Hareu kohen gadol. He's like a kohen gadol. Hatam b'sheva mitzvot tidhu. So the Gemara answers and says, not so fast, right? Yes, it's true that a goy that engages in Torah that way would be of high respect, but only when that goy is engaging in Torah as it pertains to the Shiv'a mitzvot ben Noach. And this is another reason I thought it would be pertinent to read this Teshuvah now, because we just finished Parashat Noach and we're beginning Lech Lecha with Abraham Abinu, so it kind of fits, as you'll see. But nonetheless, that is how the Gemara leaves it, and for all intents and purposes, that's pretty much how everyone recognizes it, right? So that it is specifically talking about, Rabbi Meir, at least, is now qualified as talking only about the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, and that in that area, it is entirely not only appropriate but praiseworthy for a goy to toil in Torah, right? To delve into the depths of Torah and understand these mitzvot that are applicable to him. All right. So before we get any further, I think that it's important to have a look at the halacha as presented by Rambam in the Mishneh Torah on this Gemara. And he simply says, very straightforward, goy she'asak b'Torah hayab mitah. So he sees this clearly as halacha, right? And he says that a goy who is osek in Torah is hayab mitah, lo ya'asok, right? He should only be osek in sheva mitzvot shelahen bilvad, right? That is all that a goy should do. So it seems that Rambam is posek the Talmud, straightforward, accepts the qualification of Rabbi Meir, of his words, meaning Rabbi Meir's words by the Talmud, by the Gemara, and is posek that way, right? That Sheva Mitzvot is acceptable and permitted. Now, before we look at anything else, I would like to have a look at the Teshuvah. So I'm going to present to you here the Teshuvah as we have it. Okay, and what we're looking at is the Teshuvah as presented by Rav Kafir, which I think is as reliable. It's reliable. Rav Kafir is very careful with Gersa, and he brings this Teshuvah as his part of his gloss on this halacha in Rambam, right, in the Mishneh Torah. And what he says is goy she'asak b'Torah hayab mitah, meaning he's quoting the halacha, and he says Mimrad Rabbi Yohanan b'Sanhedrin, which we just saw, right, the language of Rabbi Yohanan. V'nish'al Rabbeinu, right? The Rav was asked, Rambam was asked, Hayim ze halacha, right? So the Talmidim asked if this was halacha. Now, notice that's one question, right? That's one question. Is the Memra in Sanhedrin a halacha? What? Goy she'asak b'Torah hayab mitah. Is that halacha? That's one question. But if you notice, there are two questions here. And the second question is, Ha'im hayav kol bar Yisrael lihimana milamed meuma min mitzvot michutz l'sheva mitzvot oladrichan elein olav. Right? Notice that it isn't mentioned at all in the Gemara and Sanhedrin anything with regards to teaching the goy. Right? It simply says that if a goy learns, hayab mitah, but doesn't say anything about the deen of teaching. Right? So that they're asking as well. Right, so the one thing they're asking, is it halacha? which it would seem that they either missed or didn't see the Mishneh Torah, because Rambam clearly is posek that it's halacha. But otherwise, they're asking about teaching, and does that suggest, meaning if it is halacha, does it suggest that we are not allowed to teach them? Because if it's haya mita, then maybe we have a restriction on putting them into a situation in which they will be haya mita. Okay? So the answer is a very interesting answer. The first part, Harambam says, Hishiv, what? Hi halacha b'li safek. Right? So Harambam sees that this statement of the Talmud of Rabbi Yohanan is halacha b'li safek. Right? No question. And as you see, Harambam was posek that halacha. Now he continues, and he says, and the truth of the matter is that if Yad Yisrael tekifa alehem, meaning if Yad Yisrael, if we are sovereign, and they are living under our sovereignty, meaning a goy is living under our sovereignty, essentially a ger toshav, right? Well, then the reality is that we do not allow them to study Torah until they convert, right? Because they shouldn't be studying as goyim, and this is important, right? This is essentially Isaac, right? We shouldn't be allowing them to engage in Talmud Torah as Isaac Torah until they convert, because that's the whole idea of Morasha, right? It belongs to us, not to them. Okay. Now, notice, again here, the language is mona'im oto mitalmud, which implies we don't allow them to learn. Correct? So that's all, it's still a question of goy she'osek, as opposed to teaching. Yeah? So that addition, right, that Harambam is tagging on over there, all he's doing is qualifying, right? He's saying, look, yes, and that means that when we are in charge, we really are not to permit them to be osek b'Torah. That's our responsibility. Okay? So Harambam also wants to point out over here that if we are sovereign and we do have full judicial jurisdiction, right, and legislation, and therefore we have the capacity to punish when rules are crossed, and in some cases it might be capital punishment, this is not a capital punishment case, right? Harambam makes a very clear point of that. He says, "Eno neheragi masak b'Torah, shehare amru hayav mita velo amru neherag." Right? Notice the language of the Achamim, says Harambam. They said hayav mita, not neherag. Neherag is very different. They use the term neherag b'sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, right? If a ger toshav is over one of the sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, neherag. But that's not this. We don't have a right to put them to death if we find them osek b'Torah. That's bidei shamayim. Okay, so that's that, right? That is Harambam's treatment of what to do with a goy she'osek b'Torah. Now he comes to the second question. And the second question is, can we teach them? Which isn't explicit in the Gemara, at least not in that sugya, right? Not in that part of the Gemara. We're going to see in a minute, there's another Gemara, but it's not in that Gemara. It doesn't say anything about their learning. So what does Rambam say over here? Right? Very interesting. It says, Im hayta yad Yisrael. Oh, sorry. Umutar lelamed et mitzvot lanotzrim. He says it's permitted to teach the mitzvot. Notice, he doesn't say lelamed Torah. He says lelamed et mitzvot. You can teach the mitzvot to the Christians. Now, in Harambam's time, the only Christians were basically Catholics, right? There weren't Protestants in Harambam's time. So he says you can teach to the Notzrim, ul moshcham el hadat, and through that teaching, to attempt to bring them towards the dat, right? To bring them towards appropriate behavior. Okay, to bring them towards appropriate behavior. In what? In those mitzvot. Because there is a Gemara that says that a goy she'asak b'mitzvah, or a goy she'asa mitzvah, that a goy wanted to do mitzvah en monimoto, right? We don't have to stop him from doing mitzvot if he wants to do them appropriately, right? And so too, we don't stop him if he wants to bring a korban. We allow him to bring a korban, and we put up his korban. We don't stop them from doing that, right? So here he says it's mutar lemoshcha meladat ve'asur linhog ken im ha'yishmaelim. But you may not teach mitzvot to a Yishmaeli, right? Essentially to a Muslim. So here, very, very interesting, because we usually think of it as the opposite, right? We think the Muslims at least have a ma'ala that they're not of the Avodah Zarah. And the Notzrim have a mi'ud. Why? Because they're of the Avodah Zarah. And here Rambam says, but interestingly, a Notzri you can teach Torah, a Yishmaeli you cannot teach Torah. And then he explains why. He says it's relatively simple. He says, look, mehamat mashi adua, right? The reason why you cannot teach Torah to a Muslim is because it is known. Hem sovrim shetorah zo eno min hashamayim. They hold that our Torah is not from Shamayim. Now, just to clarify that, right? Muslims believe that the original Torah in their mind, whatever they consider it to be, was from Shamayim, and we ruined it, right? In other words, it got mishubash along the way over the generations. So what we have as our Torah, according to the Muslims, is not mishamayim. It's adulterated. So they see whatever we have as mineu be problematic, right? As mineu be flawed. So whatever it is that we teach them, they see as flawed. You see. Now, when we teach them something from the Mikra, right? They're going to see it as a corruption as to what they thought in their heads is a corruption as a result of time and mess and so on and so forth. They will not see our readings as a corrective to their reading, because they see that our reading is a shibush. So whatever we think of it or whatever we know of it is a knowledge that is stemming from shibush, has shalom. And what they have is correct. They see it in terms of their corruptions. They'll always have an answer based on how it is that they see. Why? Because their initial premise is flawed in the text itself. They'll mess everybody else up too in terms of how it is that they think. And in the end, it becomes an impediment to Israel. It causes a problem for Israel. Ha'asurin benehem ba'avonotam, who are locked in their lands because of their sins. Fascinating language. Right? So Rambam is saying we're stuck with them. We're locked in their lands. And it's because of our sins. And if we start talking Torah to them, they will only see it as a shibush, as a corruption. And then it will cause us problems because they'll start to have all of these conflations and configurations of Torah that are not appropriate. And it will cause us issues because people who are idiots will not understand, right? They'll cause anybody who doesn't have appropriate capacity to be able to deal with it to be confused and mistaken. So it's only asking for trouble, basically, is what Rambam is saying. Aval ha'arelim, but the ones with foreskins, right, which are the Christians, right, because the Muslims do milah, right? The one ma'ala they have is that they believe that our Torah is given by prophecy. It's Moshe Rabbeinu, and they believe in the full text of our Torah. They don't change the text. Just the problem is megalim panim bepirusham nehanifsad, right? They explain the pshat in strange ways, right? So they explain the words of our Torah in strange ways. And they have their own ways of reading it. But the value here is that the bedrock is the same. Meaning the words of the Torah are still the words of the Torah. The recognition that it's prophecy is still a recognition. The recognition that it's God's word to us is recognized by them. And that's very good to start with, he says. Much better than the Muslims. Now, when we can agree that this is the pasuk, but when I explain to you the meaning of the pasuk and I give you sound reasoning for the meaning of the pasuk, it's possible that they can return from their nonsense to a more correct reading and therefore more correct behavior. And even if they don't themselves, it doesn't cause us problems. They will never pick up a Christian Bible and find in the Old Testament different words. It's fascinating Teshuvot. That's Rambam's presentation, right? So first of all, this is a chidush because this is not written anywhere. This is Harambam Sivara, right? Rambam is deducing this from what the Hachamim said. Now, this is very important. In a minute, remember, I didn't read the entire halacha, right, in the Mishneh Torah. We're going to go back now and look at the other, because the question here is, minayin. Where does Rambam get this sivara, right? What is he basing this on? And who said that the allowance to teach or not the allowance to teach has to do with michshol or not michshol or anything like that? It could very well be that there's just a problem with putting a michshol in front of the goy. I mean, if he's hayab mitah, he's hayab mitah. So this is an interesting thing, right? So let's have a look first. We'll take a look over here at a few things. So before we look at the rest of the halacha over here, I just want to have a look at the Tosafot for a minute. But before we look at the Tosafot, we need to see this Gemara. So there's another Gemara. And the Gemara in Hagigah says, Amar bi'ameh, en mosrin divrei Torah legoy. We do not mosrin. Interesting again, doesn't use the word milamedin. So it's very, very, very important to notice the language, right? But it says en mosrin, which means what is moser? Moser means you do not deliver. You do not give over to the hands of a goy Torah. You don't let them have it. Shenemar lo asa chen lechol goyim shpatim bal yada'um. Right? Because it says he didn't give it to the goyim, right? He gave it to us. Bal yada'um, they don't know it. So that's the Gemara. Interesting one. Harambam not posek the Gemara. He doesn't mention it in the Mishneh Torah. So Rambam does not necessarily see this as a halacha. The Tosafot on that Gemara ask an interesting question, which seems to be quite a fundamental and straightforward question. Rabbi al-Hanan had a question always. Right? On this Gemara, right? Just recognize what he's saying, you don't give over Mesirah to Moser Torah to a goy. Just you have the fact that it says a goy that's Osek B'Torah is Hayam Mitah. And he used to ask, he would question, okay, what about Hamelamedo? It's one thing to say that a goy is not supposed to study Torah is Hayam Mitah. What about teaching the goy? Teaching the goy, if the goy is hayab mitah for being osek b'Torah, then it would seem obvious that a milamedo is over on lifnei aver lo titen michshol because asur lehem. So now you might want to answer, tema shiva mitzvot didhu de'eno hayab mitah, right? So you say no, it's talking only about the shiva mitzvot b'nei Noach, and then shiva mitzvot b'nei Noach that in that too you should not be moser Torah. Meaning that's what the Gemara in Hagigah is saying. Kedamar says Hatam. But that can't be. Why? Because we know that there's a mitzvah to show them, to teach them the Sheva Mitzvot Ben Anoach. Right? So then he brings the case with Rabbi Yohanan, excuse me, with Rabbi Meir. And so on and so forth. So Yesh Lomar, and that's why we said that when is he like a Kohen Gadol? When he's also Lomed Shiva Mitzvot. So he wants to answer, right? This Gemara, which is saying that you're not to be moser divrei Torah to an oved kochavi to a goy, is when you have another oved avodah zarah that wants to teach him Torah. For that, however he knows it or whatever the case may be, he wants to teach him Torah. What is that tantamount to? That's tantamount to a very well-known case in of two sides of a nahar, of a river, where if you have a situation in where you want to give a nazir wine, right? That's nifnei avelo tetem machshol. And the only way that to get wine is on the other side of a river, you're not allowed to give it to him. But if you have somebody down the river on the same side that's going to give him the wine, and it's either you or the other guy, that's not nifnei avelo tetem machshol because he's going to get it regardless. And that's what he's trying to put over here. He's saying, look, if he's going to get the Torah regardless, then maybe that's not a problem. And he says that's what the Gemara in Hagigah is coming to address, in that it says Moser, that you're not allowed to be Moser Torah to Goy, right? Even when there's another Oved Avodah Zarah that's ready to give him Torah. Okay, so that's a whole Shakla V'Tarya that the Tosafot is doing. But the question of Tosafot is an important one. The question in the first place is, isn't it a problem if Ner Ve'lo Titeh Mechshol, full stop, if you teach a Goy Torah? Because he's Hayamita by learning Torah. And it seems clearly that Rambam is not Hoshesh to any of this. He's not Hoshesh to it, not in the Halakha and Mishneh Torah, because he doesn't mention it at all in Mishneh Torah. He doesn't say anything about teaching, right? And in the Teshuvah, he clearly differentiates. So what we need to look at is Rambam is looking at this in a different way. And I think that he even sees, I think we can even see the Gemara in Hagigah through the lens of Rambam and how it is that he sees it, right? But let's have a look at the halakha, because I think that we get some insight in the halakha that Rambam presents. Again, goy she'asak b'Torah hayab mita. All right, so we've established that it's a clear mimra, Rabbi Yohanan and Sanhedrin. Lo ya'asok ela b'sheva mitzvot shelahem bedbad. They should only be learning and engaging in and toiling with their 7 mitzvot. And then he adds over here another halakha. V'chen goy she'shavat, afilu b'yom yimot ha'chol. A goy who keeps Shabbat, so to speak, even if he does Shabbat on a Monday, right? Im asa'ahu le'atzmo kemo Shabbat, if he treated it as though it was Shabbat, hayab mitah. So too, here it's hayab mitah, not ne'erag, right? Ve'en tzarich lomar im asa mo'ed la'atzmo, right? I have to say, all the more so if he sets up a mo'ed for himself. Now the next words are very important, right? Rambam sees it necessary to qualify all of this and to give a general frame to the entire treatment of goyim doing things that are unique to us. This is important, right? Because what Torah and Shabbat have in common is that Torah is a morasha keilat Yaakov, and Torah's oti beni uben bnei Israel, right? So it's something that's special. It's something that belongs to us. It's something that is unique to Israel. And a goy that starts to take those things is problematic. Kelalo shel davar, right? Bottom line, says Rambam, en manihin otam lehadesh davar ve'la'asot mitzvot le'atzman mida'atan. We do not allow for them to engage in mitzvot and to create some kind of artificial religion using our mitzvot performed in their own terms. You hear that, right? That we do not allow them to perform mitzvot on their terms. And that includes Talmud Torah. And that's why we say they're hayab mitah. Ela o ye ger tzedek, either they become a ger tzedek and become part of Klal Yisrael, V'ikabel kol mitzvot, and they accept the entirety of mitzvot with the whole corpus of mitzvot and the berit and so on and so forth. Or let him do his Torah, not add and not subtract to it. But if he's going to start taking mitzvot, cherry picking mitzvot, and start studying Torah as though he likes to engage in this endeavor, but he does not take it on in its full context, that we don't allow. That's not appropriate. And the reason why it's not appropriate is because it's no longer Torah, and it's no longer a mitzvah, and it's no longer Shabbat, and it is essentially extracting details from our context of Brit with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and using it for some other context and some other Brit. Some other, not even Brit, some other personal frame. That's not acceptable. That's theft. And that's why Rambam says either they accept the entire frame or they do what's for them to do. But they don't start drawing out from our frame into their frame and creating their own dat. V'im asak b'Torah or Shabbat or hidesh davar makinoto. In that case, we do give them lashes. Umodeinoto, and we tell them shu hayab mitalze, that they are culpable to death by the hands of heaven. Avalenu neherag, but they're not put to death. Now, if we recognize that, we can much better understand, at least I believe, Rambam's Teshuvot. Because the whole point here is, if I end up in a situation, now notice Rambam doesn't say anything about teaching Torah here. It would seem then, lecha ora, and again, the Gemara doesn't say anything about teaching Torah. It says we're not about to be moser Torah to them, which is a different thing. We should look at it in a moment. But teaching Torah, there should only be one question. If I teach Torah to the Goy, will they potentially come into the Brit of Israel or not? Rambam says a Notzri you can teach, because the Notzri has a stronger foundation, because they have the Torah and they accept the Torah as being Torah. It's just that they have this other edition that they have, that they've written, that kind of is megale panim shelo ka'alacha. But the potential of being able to read it accurately and appropriately is there. So by all means do it. And then, of course, you have to be concerned as to whether there's going to be a michshol to Israel. Right? Yeah, okay, so there's much less of a problem of a michshol to Israel, because you can always go back to the text. The text is the same. You open any Bible in any hotel and it's going to have the same words, chapter and verse. But that's not the case with the Ishmaelim, with the Muslims. The Muslims, you can't do that to. The Muslims, there's no way that you're going to bring them to look at your Torah and come to the Dat Emet, because they believe that your Torah is flawed. And so there's no, you can't get out the gate. And if that's the case, it makes more sense, I believe, right, to say that this Gemara is specifically using the word moser. Right? We do not give over divrei Torah to them, because that means we're just giving it to them. That we're not allowed to do. If you want to teach them in order to be able to draw them, that's a different story. But to just take Torah and give it to them, that you cannot do. It doesn't belong to them. So that's an important nuance here, because Rambam is saying it should always be in potential to draw them close, and at the very least, not create problems for Israel in the exposure of our Torah to them. This, by the way, is why the Hachamim say that after the Torah was translated into Greek, the nafla olam choshech shlosha yamim, the world fell into darkness for 3 days. Why? Because suddenly our Torah was exposed and in the hands of people that it doesn't belong to. So that is a big difference, right? In Mosrin divrei Torah. You can't just give them words of Torah and say, here, have a nice day, right? Either it is to be able to show them Yisrael and to bring them as to be, at the very least, friends and connected to Israel, to teach them something meaningful in their life, or not, or don't do it. And at the very least, be very careful not to put Israel in trouble. So Rambam has this brilliant assertion as to how it is this is to be done. And that's his Pesach. It's a Pesach din. It's not in the Mishnah Torah, but that's the beauty of the Teshuvot, right? There's Piskei din in there that you recognize, Harambam's Pesach din. And as Hacham Ovadia writes in the beginning, he has a Hakdama, the Pe'erador. He says a klal. He says that if there's a halakha in Shulchan Aruch, and there is a teshubah that we find of Rambam that negates the teshubah, the halakha in Shulchan Aruch, we're posek like the teshubah of Rambam, not like the halakha in Shulchan Aruch. And he goes so far as to say that if Maran was to see the teshubah of Rambam, he would be posek like the teshubah of Rambam. So this Pesach, the Piskei Din of Rambam and the Teshuvot are very powerful. And this is a clear one. And it's a fascinating one, right? And it's important to be able to recognize. And I just thought, besides the fact that we're in Parashat Noah, and we're coming to, Abraham Avinu, and we look at, interestingly, the Christians, traditionally, we see them conceptually as heirs or children of Esav. And we see the Ishmaelim as children of Ishmael, obviously, right? The Muslims as descendants, spiritually at the very least, of Ishmael. And at the end of the day, Esav is our twin brother. That's something that we're seeing play out very, very significantly right now, in terms of what's going on in world events. Our twin brother is standing by us. And the Ishmaelim, not so much. And of course, there are various aspects of Esav, right? It's the beautiful drasha on the hug and kiss of Esav to Yaakov. Right? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says he genuinely kissed him. There was a part of Esav that genuinely loved Yaakov very much and missed Yaakov and wanted to be connected to Yaakov. He just couldn't get around himself. That was the problem, which is always the case. Esav can never get around his own personal needs and desires, but he loves his brother. And Ishmael was never the case. So at the end of the day, they may have Brit Milah, and they may not be Oved Avodah Zarah, but they're not part of the family. Okay, with that, I bid you good evening, good night, and a nice little insight over here, and a beautiful Pesach Din of Harambam, and Yira Hatzon, that we should be able to be Zochet to study Torah, L'mod Lamed Yishmor La'asod U'Tkayem, and that it should be a good year for the Habura of Torah and Hidush and strength, and Yira Hatzon, that it should be Geulah L'Yisrael. All right.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dweck, for that insightful class.
Pleasure.
And we'll see you next week for the question and answer.
Look forward.
Thank you.
Good night.